Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today we are doing a sort of part 2 from last week's video, but if you haven't seen last week's, then that's fine. You don't need to have seen that one first, because we are going to continue our look at special rules for special units. Now, last week we went through all of the major nations and we picked 2 infantry regiments that I thought were worthy of additional special rules. Now, if you had a different regiment that you thought was worthy of a special rule, then that's great. What I really liked about the video, and there was some really positive engagement with it, so I want to thank everyone who commented on that video. There was some very nice comments, so thank you for that. And there were people who were saying that they were happy with the regiments I picked, but also some people who were saying that they would have picked other regiments with some ideas for their special rules as well. That's absolutely fantastic. That's the kind of thing I love to see. I don't want this to be these are the 2 regiments that are the special infantry units, or in this case going to be the special cavalry regiments, but I want that to be a kicking off point for you to say to yourself, well, you know what, I really like this unit, and I can give them a special rule and justify it because they did this during the Napoleonic era. That's sort of what I'm looking for. So if you have a disagreement, if you think that the rules I've chosen are wrong for that unit, or you think that there's another unit that you would give different special rules to in preference, absolutely fantastic. Let me know down in the comments below. But that's enough preamble. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of today's video and look at the 2-ish special cavalry regiments from each nation. Now, we're going to start with probably the most difficult one, and that is the British, because they have a number of special rules already that make them exceptionally powerful. I've said often before on this channel, and if you've seen any of the battle reports, particularly the last one with the British in, their cavalry is super strong. So I'm actually going to change their special rule because it's currently ridiculous, and then we'll move on from there, shall we say. So the change I'm going to make... So, well, let's start off, really, I guess, with what is the special rule that the British have. So they have the special rule, gallop at everything. And that means that they get a bonus to their strategy rating if they are ordered to charge. And that's fair enough. I don't think anyone's necessarily got many problems with that one. And the other special rule that's part of that is that they must always overrun into their front arc if they destroy the enemy. So that's all good as well. No problem with that. I would slightly change it to be that they have to move a full move directly forward unless they come up against an impassable obstacle. So, you know, if they're 4 inches away from a castle wall, they're not just going to vault over the wall or something like that. So they have to move straight forward after they've won their combat. Now, the second, or I should say the third part of this special rule, is that they get to re-roll all their failed rolls to hit in combat when they charge or countercharge. This, for me, is where they become far too powerful. So, I'm going to change that rule, and then the 2 special units I'm going to give are going to be in relation to that changed rule. So, the rule I'm going to change is they don't re-roll all failed hits all the time. They re-roll all their failed hits, so it's still very powerful, but only on the first charge of that turn, or counter-charge of that turn. So it means that if they overrun into another enemy, then their horses are blown, they don't get all of those rerolls. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still incredibly powerful. I would expect a unit of, say, British Heavy Dragoons to probably defeat a unit of Cuirassiers at that point, if not, certainly draw with them, due to the Heavy Cavalry D3 rule. But it's still pretty powerful, but less than it was. And it allows the French player to counteract with maybe a more powerful unit. So, for instance, the British charge the Hussars or something like that, and then they overrun into the Cuirassiers, and that's where the trouble starts for them. So, because we're taking something away from them, we have to give them something else. And my suggestion is going to be for the Heavy Dragoon units, so we're talking the Scots Greys, the Enniskillen Dragoon Guards, units like that, I would give them a new special rule called Guaranteed Never to Fail. Now, that was stamped on the sabres of the British Heavy Cavalry, and in this case, I'm going to say that they get to re-roll one of their dice in the second round of combat. So, effectively, it gives them Tough Fighter. So, it's actually a downgrade from their current rules, but I think their current rules are way too strong as it stands anyway. I think you could also give this to the Household Cavalry as well. Basically, any British heavy cavalry unit. You could also give it to the KGL, I guess. The second special rule that I'm going to recommend is for a specific unit, though, and it is for the Scots Greys. Now, there's two things that I can call this special rule. I'll let you guys decide. We can either call it a hard contest, which is the name of the vignette that the Perry Miniatures do, or we can call it Scotland Forever. Either one of those is fine. The hard contest comes from, well, I'll read the quote. It comes from Sergeant Hewitt, describing when he captured the Eagle of the 45th Line Regiment at Water. I think it was the 45th Line. Anyway, he said, quote, "It was in the first charge I took the Eagle from the enemy. He and I had a hard contest for it. He made a thrust at my groin. I parried it off and cut him down through the head. After this, a lancer came at me. I threw the lance off to my right side and cut him through the chin and upward through the teeth. Next, a foot soldier fired at me and charged me with his bayonet, which I also had the good luck to parry, and then I cut him down through the head. Thus ended the contest. As I was about to follow my regiment, the general," so that's General Ponsonby, said, and he's quoting Ponsonby here, "My brave fellow, take it to the rear. You have done enough till you get quit of it." End quote. And then back to Sergeant Hewitt, which I was obliged to do, but with great reluctance. End quote. So I think we should probably call it a hard contest, although Scotland Forever is, of course, the painting that you can almost certainly see on the screen right now. And for this one, I'm going to go back to my special rules about capturing the colours. And normally, you capture the enemy's colours on a 6 if you destroy them in combat. You get to add 1 if you're cavalry, and you get to add 2 if your cavalry the enemy is infantry. However, for the first time that you make that roll for the Scots Greys, you get to add 1 to that roll. So you actually captured it on a 3+. So that's my idea for capturing the colours for the Scots Greys in particular. I believe they might have, they captured some, well, I say captured, they did naughty things to some French prisoners after they freed some Austrians in the very early war. So I thought about doing something related to that. But we're going to leave it at that. They'll be excellent at capturing colours. I think that's probably the most famous thing that the Scots Greys did. And again, you could also apply that to the... who's who captured the Eagle of the 105th? I want to say it was the Household Cavalry, but I'm not 100% sure about that one. Might have been the Skins. Not sure. But anyway, you could also apply it to those guys as well. So with the British out of the way, we can move on to one of my other favourite Napoleonic nations. We can move on to the armies of the Tsar and the cavalry of Russia. Now, Russia had an absolute gazillion cavalry units. They really did just have them absolutely all over the place. But I have singled 2 out in particular. I'll do the first one, which is going to be the less surprising, and I hope the second one is a bit more of a new discovery for some of you and a bit more exciting. So the first one, well, actually the first one was the most exciting one to me, and that is, to the shock of no one, the Military Order Cuirassiers. Now, these guys were the Knights of St. John that had fled Malta when it was captured by Napoleon on his way through to Egypt. And these guys formed, I think it was the 4th, but don't quote me on that one, Cuirassier regiment in the Russian army. Now, they did have some changes to their uniforms. This is quite a nice thing. I don't think anyone does heads for them, but if anyone wants to commission a set of heads for the Military Order Cuirassiers, Richie, then that might not necessarily be a bad idea. But they had the Star of St. George on their helmets instead of the double-headed eagle, and their facings were black. Now, these guys are so cool, they're going to have 2 special rules. The reason I'm going to give them 2 is because the first one, which I think is the coolest one, is going to come up so rarely that it's not even worth having. And again, it's a little bit silly, but I'm going to call it Deus Vult, which is Latin for God wills it. And they are going to reroll all fails to hit in the first round of combat against any Ottoman troops. So they basically have the Fanatic special rule for that one. It's incredibly powerful. It's going to be particularly powerful against Ottomans because they're a bit terrible anyway. But there you go. Deus Vult is their special rule. But I'm going to give them a second one as well. They too captured an eagle, this time at Eylau, and of the 2nd Battalion of the 24th line. Now, I'm not just going to give them the +1 to capture an enemy flag, because we've already done that, and it's a little bit boring. I'm sure it'll come up again. So what I'm going to recommend with these guys is, because the way they captured the eagle was, unlike Sergeant Newitt, who fought his way through a load of men, got the eagle, and then managed to get it away to safety, the military autocraziers just basically slaughtered everyone, so the eagle was the only thing that was left. Not quite, but pretty close. So I'm going to recommend for the military autocraziers, if they have charged, so only if they charge, and the enemy takes a break test, then they have to suffer an additional -1 to their break test. So that's just to represent the sheer ferocity of the charge of these, what are effectively mounted knights. But it would, it means they're more likely to break, so they're more likely to get to roll to capture the eagle in the first place, rather than just being more likely to capture it if they break the enemy. Now, for the second unit I'm going to look at, this one is a regiment of hussars. It is the Lubny Hussar Regiment. Now, this is a really interesting regiment in the Russian army, because most Russian units, infantry and cavalry alike, were raised due to a poll tax. So you will basically have a village, and there would be a poll where 1 in 25 young men would be pulled out of the pot, and then they would have to go off, and they would probably never see the village again. If you've seen my video on the Russian army, you'll know that the village is usually held at a funeral for the guy who was leaving the village to join the army. It doesn't bode particularly well, does it? But that's the Russians for you. Now, this was very different. This was an all-volunteer regiment, and I'm just going to go through a list of the countries, or the nationalities, of the troops that made up the unit. So you had Russians and Tartars, obviously. So Tartars are down in the south, the Caucasus region, really. Greeks, Serbs, Hungarians, Poles, Moldovans, Turks, Jews, and even Italians all fought in this unit. And they weren't the usual illiterate farmhands either. They were members of the gentry, could be in the unit, as you've seen. Foreigners could be as well. And these guys, being volunteers, only served 6 years in the regiment. But I guess in the Napoleonic Wars, 6 years can cover a lot of time, a lot of battles. Now, they were led by Colonel Alexei Melesino, and he was regarded as something of a very good-looking gentleman. In fact, he was considered so good-looking that they actually sculpted a statue of the Tsar using him as the model, because he was obviously better-looking than the Tsar, although don't tell him that. Now, he ruled the regiment with an absolute iron fist. He referred to them all as scum. They didn't have ranks, they were just called scum, which is pretty hardcore, I'm not going to lie. Now, he would eventually, in fact, he called them the scum of all vagabonds. Now, he would eventually be killed at the Battle of Dresden. He was killed by 3 musket balls fired at him by the Young Guard, although there's also some suggestion that he was killed by maybe a 6-pound cannon or a light cannon. So while Melesino is in command, the regiment gets the drilled special rule. That represents the iron authority that he ruled the unit with. Now, normally when there is a number of different nationalities in a unit, I question that unit's effectiveness because it makes command and control far more difficult. However, this guy was something of a Renaissance man, and he spoke several languages perfectly fluently, so it would have meant that getting his orders across was probably a lot easier than it would have been for maybe an Austrian colonel in the same place. So they're going to get the drilled special rule, and also to represent him, they are going to have an extra hand-to-hand dice. So most Hussar units have 6 dice, well, Lubny Hussars get 7. However, this is only while he is still alive. So every time the unit takes a hit, roll a dice. On a 6, then he has been killed. Now, if he has been killed, they lose the drilled special rule. They also lose their extra attack dice. So try not to get the colonel killed. Old Alexei Melesino. That's his name. Try not to get him killed, because he gives you drilled and the extra hand-to-hand dice. Now, quickly before we leave the land of the bear, I have mentioned before about the Guard Cossacks. They are not very well represented in A Clash of Eagles. They are just Cossacks with an extra dice. I think that's a very, very poor way of dealing with them. They should really be basically cuirassiers, but with lancers. That's how I would equip them. So I guess you could say Guard Hussars as well. Might be better, actually. So yes, in fact, Guard Hussars would be much better. So treat them as Guard Hussars, because Russian Hussars obviously come with lancers. So having dealt with the Russians, we now move on to the mighty empire of Austria. Now Austria had arguably the best cavalry, certainly mounted and equipped in the Napoleonic Wars. You could argue either way, but there's certainly an argument to be made that the Austrians were very good. And the key with their cavalry is they were supremely confident in their own abilities. Quite a few times, the Austrian cavalry would attack much larger forces themselves, or even heavier forces than themselves, and I mean, that sometimes got them in trouble, sometimes not. So, as an example, in Dave Hollins's Hungarian Hussar, the Osprey book, he talks about how 4 Hussars wanted to attack 40 French chasseurs. Their Oberleutnant ordered them to fall back as they were outnumbered, and grumbled unhappy Gemenier, this is according to Dave Collins, I have never heard that we have to count the enemy before we attack. There was another time where a Hussar, who was a chap called Samuel Hemmer, engaged a Cossack patrol on his own. This is when the Austrians were fighting as part of the French army during the invasion of Russia. So what I'm going to recommend with the Austrians, this is going to be one that goes across all of their units. This is going to be, I mean, the Austrians are pretty good as it is. They're going to have the heavy cavalry +1 special rules. So that means that their light cavalry get heavy cavalry 1. Their dragoons and chevaliers get heavy cavalry D1 +1, so 2 effectively. And the heavy cavalry, the cuirassiers, they get heavy cavalry D3 +1. Now this means that they have a chance to win that combat against the French, even if the French roll maximum and they've got the same number of wounds. But I don't think it's going to be too massive. It just means that the French are going to have to be better supported when they're going up against the Austrians. I'm going to say that the downside of that, though, is using, if they win a combat, you can normally move forwards, backwards, sideways, doesn't make a difference. I'm going to suggest that the Austrian cavalry can't move backwards. Now, it's not the same as the British. It's not the same as gallop at everything, because they have to move forward. The Austrians can stay where they are. They can turn to face, but they can't move backwards. If I have to single out a specific unit for individual praise, though, and at the end of the day, that's basically what this video is about, isn't it? I am going to suggest the Radetzky Hussars, and those guys fought a particularly impressive action during the Battle of Lippe, where the Austrian infantry were withdrawing, and the Austrian cavalry moved in the intervals of the withdrawing infantry to counterattack the Italian cavalry that were pressing the infantry. So I'm going to make 2, well, it depends how you play Black Powder. I'm going to make one of 2 suggestions. The first one is going to be that unless unless a friendly infantry unit is in battalion mass, they can be charged through by the unit of Radetzky Hussars. Only those. So normally I don't play interpenetration. I certainly don't play that you can charge through one of your own units. I think most people play that you can't charge through your own units. In this case, for that one specific Hussar regiment, I'm going to say that you can. Now this would apply to all units of that regiment. If you break that regiment down into 3 units, then all 3 of those units can do this. Now if you do allow interpenetration, and what I mean by interpenetration is just moving units through other ones without stopping or slowing down in any way. If you do allow that, then I'm going to suggest that with these Radetzky Hussars, they can charge from behind your own units. So that's something that most players don't do at all. But in this case, this one unit, they can do that. The Hussars were pretty good, actually. I had another suggestion, which was going to be the Hessen-Homburg Hussars. They fought at the Battle of Austerlitz, and they took a lot of fire from French skirmishers. So with those guys, then I would suggest that if you take a break test from shooting, then you count your excess casualties as 1 less than they actually are. So you're not stamina 4, you are still only stamina 3. So if you go to stamina 4, you do have to test for excess casualties, but you don't suffer a minus. So that's what I'm going to recommend with them, and that's only from shooting. They also, it must be said, reaped a heavy toll when they flanked some French infantry later on in the battle as well. So they certainly got their own back. So now we're going to move on to the army of Prussia. We're going to look at 2 light cavalry units here as well. Again, one of them may not be a surprise to some of you, especially if you've listened to my 5-part series on the Prussian army, which I would recommend that you do if you haven't. But the first one I'm going to look at is perhaps one of the most famous of the Prussian army, probably the most famous of the Prussian army, and that is the 1st Life Hussars, also known as the Death's Head Hussars. These were the absolute elite of Frederick the Great's army from the 7 Years' War. They fought a battle, I can't remember which one it is off the top of my head, but they basically won the battle on their own, so they're pretty good. They also fought in the... Here's a pub quiz question for you, if you're ever doing a Napoleon pub quiz, I don't know why you would be, but they also have the largest number of engagements of any unit in the Napoleonic Wars. It's 66, so there you go, they fought in 66 battles, and because of that, I'm going to give these guys 2 special rules. I'm going to give them the Elite 5+ special rule, because they're effectively the Guard Hussars of the Prussian army. And to give the Prussians a little bit more of a chance against those heavy French Guard units, I'm also going to say that they get Tough Fighter only when they're fighting Imperial Guard cavalry units. And this comes from, in December 1814, they routed the French Guard chasseurs. So that's my excuse for giving them that. If they're fighting against the French Guard cavalry, then they gain Tough Fighter. They reroll 1 fail to hit. You could make it all of their fails to hit. It's such a rare occurrence that I don't think it really matters either way. But those are the 2 rules I'm going to give to the 1st Life Guard Hussars. And then one of my favourite units, as I say, anyone who's listened to my series on the Prussian army will know this, the 5th Regiment of Dragoons, the Queen's Own. So actually, I lied, it wasn't 2 light infantry regiments, it was a light infantry and a medium regiment. So yes, the 5th Queen's Own Dragoons. Now, as much as I love them and the idea of them marching down the Unter den Linden with the Queen at their head, in her rather revealing outfit, it must be said, they were actually also one of the better units as well. They not only in 1806, but also later on in the war as well. In 1806, they destroyed a brigade of infantry under General Gudin, and then in 1813, they also hacked up some other poor French infantrymen as well. So I'm going to give them 2 special rules again, 1 for 1806, and then 1 for the later campaign. And that's because Queen Louise died quite relatively soon after the Treaty of Tilsit, actually. So the 1806 one is going to be called Favourites of the Queen, and these guys are going to get the Stubborn special rule. That means that they automatically pass their first morale test. So it's a good one, it's a bad one. It's not necessarily when you need it the most, because you've probably got no or maybe 1 or 2 excess casualties, but it's there. It means that they are more likely to stand and fight. And for the later one, they are going to get, yep, you guessed it, they're going to get Tough Fighter. But they're only going to get Tough Fighter against infantry. Now, you could give them Tough Fighter against infantry in 1806 as well. It wouldn't necessarily be the end of the world. But that's a much more aggressive one than the Stubborn. So it depends which way you want to look at it. The 1806 Prussian army was pretty aggressive. They thought they had all this sewn up and in the bag. So you could give them the Tough Fighter against infantry in 1806 as well. What I really like about doing these special rules for the Austrians and the Prussians in particular is because they didn't really have their guard units in the field, it just gives you that little bit of extra that you're lacking in your normal line units. Now we're going to move on to another arguably major nation which we didn't cover in the infantry video. We are going to go to the sunny lands of Spain. Now, I tried to find the reference for this unit, and unfortunately I couldn't find it in time to record this video, so I'm going to apologise up front. I'm certain that some of you will know, so if you can put it in the comments for me, then I will pin that comment. So look down into the comments, check the pinned comment for this unit. I want to say that it was the Numancia Dragoons, but I don't think it was. That's the first one that came to mind, but I don't think it is. But basically, there was a regiment of Spanish cavalry that were raised from picadors, So those are the guys who gallop round and throw the spears in the bulls during the bullfights. So I can't remember what this regiment was, but that regiment I'm going to give a special rule to called Picadors. There you go, I'm nothing if not creative. And these guys are going to be able to move to a different facing before charging. Now, they're not going to be that powerful. They're probably only going to have 5 attacks because they are a Spanish cavalry unit. They're not going to have any rerolls. But the idea is they've got such masterful relationships with their horses that they can turn them on a dime in order to escape the bull usually. But in this case, it allows them to get round the flank and then charge in the enemy, something like that. It's obviously going to cost 2 moves, and your strategy rating is not that high for the Spanish anyway. But this is going to allow them to charge from a much more advantageous position, stop the enemy counter-charging, but I think victory is still far from assured. As I say, apologies that I can't remember who the regiment of that was. Now, the second one that I'm going to recommend is El Regimiento de Coraceros Español. Now, that's the best Spanish attempt you're ever going to get from me. So, I hope you enjoyed that one. These are the Spanish cuirassiers. Now, these were formed on the 24th of May, 1810, and they were, as the name suggests, Spanish cuirassiers. Now, these guys wore French equipment. So, what I'm going to suggest with these guys is they don't quite have the training and the skill of the French cuirassiers. So I'd only give them a hand-to-hand value of 7. I should point out there are no rules for these guys in Albion Triumphant Volume 1. So they should have a hand-to-hand value of 7, a shooting value of 0, as you'd expect. They should have a stamina of 3, and this is a big change. They should have a morale save of 4+. Now, most cuirassiers have a 3+, but most Spanish cavalry have a 5+. So it is better than most Spanish cavalry, but they're not quite up to the standards of, say, a French cuirassier. Now, French cuirassiers were considered to be very good troops. Similarly, they're not quite as good as Austrian or Russian cuirassiers. Again, both of those were considered to be very well trained, very well equipped troops. So the Spanish, I'm going to give, maybe a little unfairly, only 7 attacks, only a 4+ save. If you don't like the narrative that the Spanish weren't very good in the Napoleonic Wars, if you disagree with that, if you think that was British propaganda, then that's absolutely fine. You could just give them 8 attacks and the 3+ save that a normal cuirassier would have. I will say, and I've said it many, many times, these are one of my favourite looking units in the entire Napoleonic era. They look so good with those cuirassiers against the red coats. They just look awesome. So, highly recommend. It's a shame there's no rules for them, but I would maybe just knock off 1 point from their attack and their save, but everything else same as the French cuirassiers. They also, crucially, have the heavy cavalry D3 special rule as normal. So after a quick stop off in sunny Spain, we're going to get back to the main contenders, the one you've all been waiting for. I've buried the lead long enough. Let's get to the French. Now, the French, I'm going to do more units than normal because that's just how I roll. And now the first one is going to be a charge reaction, and it's going to be stand and fire. Now, most heavy cavalry units, and certainly all dragoon units, they would have muskets or musketoons or carbines, a variety of short-barreled weapons. There is no rules for these in black powder, which is a little bit weird, but the French cavalry were known to stand and take charges at the stand and fire a volley. Now, sometimes it was helpful, sometimes it wasn't. So, I am going to give them the stand and fire special rule or charge reaction. Now, for this, they are only going to roll 2 dice, and it's going to follow all the rules for normal shooting. This doesn't give them shooting dice normally, so you can't gallop around shooting them like, Gustavus Adolphus as cuirassiers or anything, but you can stand and shoot at a charging enemy. It's risky. It is super risky. But if that enemy unit is maybe taking 2 casualties, they're only stamina 3, then it might be worth doing. If you think that you can perhaps get a cheeky disorder, then it might be worth doing as well. So, the dragoons and the cuirassiers and the chasseurs are all going to have the stand and shoot charge reaction. Now, going into the specific regiments, I'm going to single out the 8th Cuirassiers. Now, the 8th, the 8th Cuirassiers were numbered as number 8. However, they had originally, under the Austrian regime, been the King's Own Cuirassier Regiment, and they had retained their cuirassiers since 1666. So the colonel decided that they were actually the senior regiment. So all their saddle cloths had a 1 on them, which super annoyed Napoleon. So I'm going to give them the special rule, and I'm going to say if they are in a brigade with another Cuirassier regiment that has line of sight to them, then they always count as scoring a 3 on their heavy cavalry roll. So that means that they still have to, well, they don't have to win the combat so much, I guess, but it does mean that they always count the maximum for that. Now, this is quite a powerful special rule, because although they're not killing the enemy, they are more likely to win combats. So they become quite a dangerous unit then. You can nerf that by getting rid of their brigade mates, or just making sure that they're out of line of sight. Maybe they're ahead of them, something like that. But if they are in the line of sight of another Cuirassier regiment within their brigade, then they automatically score a 3 on the heavy cavalry roll, and that is the 8th Cuirassiers. Now I'm going to turn my attention to not 1 but 2 Hussar units, and this is the 5th and the 7th Hussars. These were part of the Infernal Brigade, once commanded by possibly the greatest cavalry commander of all time, because he's certainly better than Murat, and that is General Lasalle. Now, these guys were considered to be something of an elite. It seems to me a bit silly that they only get 6 dice each, so I'm going to suggest if they are commanded by General Lasalle, he also had a chasseur unit in his brigade as well. I can't remember which one, so you could add that in there. Then they gain 2 extra hand-to-hand dice each, so they suddenly have 8 hand-to-hand attack dice. That makes them as powerful as a Cuirassier regiment. So, they don't have the save though, and they don't have the heavy cavalry special rule, but the 5th and the 7th Hussars, when led as part of the Infernal Brigade, I would give them I would give them the +2 dice each in hand-to-hand combat, and I would also give them a bonus for when they're being ordered to charge the enemy as well. And finally, we're going to look at a unit which also doesn't have rules in Black Powder, but this one's more allowable, because they actually haven't done a book that covers the period when the 1st and 2nd Carabiniers weren't in their armour. As they currently are, they are effectively Cuirassiers. They weren't always so. They were kind of heavy dragoons at one point. So for the Carabiniers pre-1812, I would give them probably 7 attack dice. I would make them effectively dragoons. However, I would give them a plus and a minus here. I would give them an extra point of morale save. The Carabiniers were in no doubt that they were the premier line cavalry regiment. In fact, when they were issued with cuirasses, they saw that as a stain upon their honour. However, they didn't really have a huge amount of honour, because they ran away a lot. I mean, a lot. They were routed by Cossacks at one point. So I would also give them the wavering special rule as well. That's a little bit harsh, but what I give with one hand, I taketh away with the other. So I would give them +1 to their save, so they're less likely to take casualties. However, when they do take casualties, then they are more likely to run away. Because, as I say, they ran away a lot. And that's a massive shame, because they're an absolutely awesome looking unit. But that's for their pre-1812. After 1812, I mean, even after 1812, you could give them the same thing. But we're not going to. That's just going to be their pre-1812 status. So that's it. We've had a quick gallop. See what I did there? Through the different special units of the Napoleonic Wars. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's made you look at a couple of units and say, you know what, yeah, I'd like to introduce some rules for those as well. Or maybe you think that I've not been as creative with these as I could have been, and maybe you guys can think of a better example of special rules that fit these units. Please let me know down in the comments below. And as I say, check down there for whatever that Spanish cavalry regiment was. If I don't find it in time, I'm sure someone will post it in the comments. But thank you very much for watching. Those of you who don't know, every December I do a prize draw giveaway. I'll be announcing that probably next week, or maybe the week after, actually. But Keep your eyes peeled for that. I just want to say a special thanks to, we've had a couple of people join the channel membership recently. You can see a join button down below. All of the proceeds go towards helping the channel, so thank you very much for you guys who have. We've even had a Marshal of the Empire. I only just got the notification of that recently, so thank you very much. These will be on the end cards at the end of the videos. I just want to say thank you so much for supporting the channel, and as I said at the beginning of the video, thank you so much for the really kind comments and the nice comments that we had in the last video. I hope that we make this a positive place to be. Actually, I might announce it in 2 weeks, because I've just thought, speaking of positivity, that we've got the... Sorry for listening with earphones. That's just scrambled your brains. But I just remembered in 2 weeks' time, I will have seen the Napoleon film. So we'll have to see. I may tag it on to the end of that. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.